Good evening. Welcome to Evensong. We're celebrating Easter here at Second Congregational Church. We've been doing it all week long. And today is the day that, it's Saturday, so technically Easter is on Sunday. But we're celebrating this moment because we know that there's Good Friday, right? And Jesus had died on Friday. But what happened between Friday and Sunday? What is the story telling us? And the story really points to, this part in the gospel story really points to the cross. You know the cross, you see it everywhere. People wear it as jewelry, you see it on top of churches. Today we're going to find out what the cross actually meant to Jesus. And if we can answer that question, what was the cross for Jesus, maybe that can inspire us for living today. So before we continue to worship God, why don't you close your eyes and center yourself. You know, people do this at gyms. They go every week. They go every day. Because to stay physically fit is a challenge. It's not very easy to do. You have to work at it. You have to dedicate time to it. And the same goes for Christianity, for spirituality. It's something that needs to be employed. The worst thing you can do with it is worship it. The worst thing you can do with Christianity is worship it. It will feel distant and far away. The best thing you can do with this is employ it into your life. And what Jesus does is he symbolically represents God speaking to us from far away. And in the man of Jesus, God comes down and lives like one of us, walks every day like one of us, gets sick like one of us, gets hungry and thirsty like one of us, has brothers and sisters and all kinds of relationships like one of us. Jesus doesn't skip to the good parts of life. Jesus found that the best parts of life were overcoming the very things trying to prevent life. And that's the magic. That's the power, this symbology that takes place in the cross. And so when Jesus says, I need to go to my cross and you need to pick up your cross, Jesus is inviting us to play and to live in every circumstance and situation. Jesus is the cross climber and the cross overcomer, and he's going to teach us and his disciples how to do it. But first, he's got to try it out himself, make sure it works. Can't be teaching people stuff that doesn't work. So today we remember what Jesus taught and remembered what worked for him and all those disciples. So we join in that ancient prayer that Jesus taught his disciples to say 2,000 years ago. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come and thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us of our debts, and help us to forgive those who have debts against us. And lead us not into any temptations. But if we find ourselves there, lead us away from evil. For yours is the glory and the power forever and ever. Amen.
Stars they wept, the morning sun was dead, the Savior of the world was fallen, his body on the cross, his blood poured out for us, the weight of every curse upon him. Final breath he gave, as heaven looked away, the Son of God was laid in darkness. The battle in the grave, the war on death was waged, the power of hell forever broken. The ground began to shake, the stone was rolled away, his has rendered you defeated. Forever He is glorified. Forever He is lifted high. Forever He is risen. He is alive. He is alive. The ground began to shake. The stones rolled away. His perfect love could not be overcome. Now death, where is your sting? Our resurrected King has rendered you defeated. Forever He is glorified. Forever He is lifted high. Forever He is risen. He is alive. He is alive. We sing hallelujah. We sing hallelujah. We sing hallelujah. The Lamb is overcome. We sing hallelujah. We sing hallelujah. We sing hallelujah. The Lamb is overcome. We sing hallelujah. We sing hallelujah. We sing hallelujah. The Lamb is overcome. We sing hallelujah. We sing hallelujah. We sing hallelujah. The Lamb is overcome. Forever He is glorified. Forever He is lifted high. Forever He is risen. He is alive. He is alive.
If you're with somebody, can you turn to them and say, He is risen? And if they don't know, or maybe they do know, will that person say, He is risen indeed? Or if you're alone, can you help me? He is risen. Perfect. Someone asked me to do something this weekend, and I told them it was busy. It's Easter, right? And they said, really? What are you doing? I didn't get the question until I realized, oh, I'm not doing anything. I'm just staying home. We're not going anywhere for Easter. But Christ is risen. This is good news. We like to hold on to times, for times like this. Christ is risen. The good news of Jesus Christ and the power of the old rugged cross. That simple symbol floating above us right there in our church now hangs from our tall ceilings. It can be found in most churches on top of steeples, painted on our windows and walls. Some people wear them as jewelry, and some people even get them a tattoo of it. Have you ever thought about the symbol of our faith? The cross? And if you've never heard of the cross, just imagine you never heard of Christianity. Maybe you think it was just like a giant T. Because if you've never heard of the cross, you might ask, what does it mean? Because this is the crazy part about it. The cross is the ancient world's way of punishing criminals. Did you know that? It was their version of the electric chair, the guillotine, their firing squad. And if you think of it that way, then the cross is literally an instrument of death, capital punishment. And would you ever wear a tiny replica of those things around your neck? You know, a machine gun or a guillotine? Or would you ever even think to paint those things on the ceilings of the Sistine Chapel? So crosses being used as the symbol of Christianity, stepping back for just a second, it's a little strange. If you ever see me walking around town, I always have a messenger bag. And on that messenger bag is a bandana. Do you know what that bandana is? No. How could you know? You would need me to tell you. I wore that bandana throughout my Israel trip. Around my neck, I felt like Indiana Jones going on an adventure. And that's what the bandana reminds me. It gives meaning. It reminds me life is an adventure. And you wouldn't know that unless I told you about the bandana. In order to know what it means, it would help if I explained it, right? You know that game that people play? If you could meet anyone from past history, who would it be? So many people would pick Jesus. But what would you say to Jesus? What would you ask? If only Jesus was here. Surprise! No, I don't have Jesus here. Particularly if Jesus did come on Easter. Because then I would ask him, I'd sit him down and maybe have an interview with him and say, hey, Jesus, what was the cross to you? What was that all about? Why is it so important? Why did you talk about it so much to the disciples? And why do you think it became the symbol of Christianity? I'm ready to ask Jesus questions. So let's find out today what the cross meant to Jesus. Then let's ask what the cross meant to those disciples back then. And if we can understand what it meant for Jesus and the people back then, maybe we can draw inspiration from that for our personal lives today. So in terms of council meetings, I don't think that Jesus had any say on the church logo process. Because maybe he wanted something else. Maybe some nice calligraphy lettering, JC, exclamation point. Jesus was clearly a Mets fan. Somebody might say, how do you know? He was a man of many sufferings. And maybe he would have chosen a bat and a ball. And the tagline, crushing it for God. Maybe a fishing pole. Jesus liked to talk about fishing. And there were other symbols in the early church. There was the fish, the anchor, the mustard seed, the dove, the triangle representing the Trinity. Sometimes they're used. Sometimes you see those. But the winner was the cross. The cross won. Out of all those, they choose the symbol, an instrument of death as their symbol. But Jesus will talk about the cross his entire life, alluding to it throughout the Gospels. You will hear this line and variations of it so many times that I had to just focus on one gospel. I couldn't focus on them all because I would just be here reading a list of times this phrase pops up in Jesus' narratives. So this is just from John. My hour has not yet come. Says that in John chapter 2. An hour is coming. John chapter 4. John chapter 5. An hour is coming. This is not all the same line. These are just throughout the story. In John chapters 7 and 8, it mentions his hour had not yet come. multiple times. In chapter 12, it changes, the hour has come. Then it says, and for this purpose I came to this hour. Chapter 13 says, Jesus, knowing that his hour had come. Chapter 16, an hour is coming for everyone. And towards the end of that chapter, he says, behold, an hour is coming. And finally, in John chapter 17, it says, Father, the hour has come. Again, I only cited one gospel. You can hear it over and over. You get it. The hour that Jesus is talking about is important. And what hour is Jesus referring to? What does it mean, and why is it significant to Jesus? Why is he saying this phrase over and over and over again? This is hermeneutics, the study of interpretation. And it's a field of study that teaches you to think this way. If you want to understand the cross the Bible talks about, then you got to ask, what was the cross for Jesus? His disciples tell us in one of the stories that he had the cross. It tells us in all the stories that Jesus had the cross on his mind from day one. As if Jesus knew this is where his ministry would end up. You see, Jesus believed he had discovered an evolved God. A God who wasn't the God of old, but that God was someone who was on the move. That God, in fact, was changing from this God of strict rules to a God of infinite grace. Jesus really believed this. Jesus believed God was near and personal, that you didn't have to worship God in a building, but that you could worship God when you helped your neighbor, fed the hungry, and lived out the ideals religion preached. He didn't want us to be forced to pretend to love, pretend to be kind, pretend to be forgiving, pretend to be patient, pretend to be happy. Jesus actually wanted to become these things. Jesus believed his own message to its very core. And so when he looked at the religion of his day, he observed that its chief end was to sing to God on Sundays and become better at judging others who don't attend worship. Religion did little to nothing in leading people to God. And in fact, Jesus found that it had led them further away. Jesus had critiqued the whole system as fake, inauthentic, and not working. Imagine you're Jesus and you live in this environment. Imagine you knew that what was going on was wrong, was a great injustice to God and humanity. Jesus wants to do something about this. Anyone who stands up to an institution is going to face the heat. That heat for Jesus was the cross. And it represented this moment when Jesus would be faced with selling out and saving his own skin, or he could do what he ended up doing. The exact opposite of selling out and saving his own skin. But boldly riding into Jerusalem on an ass with a message to those in power. When I was a kid, we had a lake house in upstate New York, and there was a big lake and a big diving board. Everything was big because I was little. There was a big diving board where you'd go fishing and jump off to go swimming. And one day there was a party, and the adults were watching on shore. I hadn't learned to swim yet, so I had my big tube on. And I ran to the tip of the diving board edge and pulled back and then just launched myself off. And I did that over and over. But one time I ran. I jumped, but my tube, I jumped like this and I was so excited, my tube just shot off my head. And I was holding on to it, but it was gone. I couldn't swim. I was a little kid. But when I landed in the water, I started paddling. I just started swimming. I guess I could swim. Everyone was watching this happen and ended up cheering. They were waving and signaling, "Hey, great job, but come back, come back." I said, "No thanks. I'm good out here. I'm a swimmer." Swam over and grabbed my tube and eventually jumped off the diving board again. No tube this time, thank you very much. Jesus, in his diving in to know about God, had his tube come off. Found himself in the deep end with God. Saw he didn't need religious teachings or leaders to keep him afloat. For the God he discovered was not a God that simply keeps people afloat. This is the God that gets you to walk on water. Jesus had found God. He found God in his personal life. Found God at the store, at the hospital, at work, in the market, everywhere he went. Couldn't escape. Found that God was everywhere except one place. Church. Temple. The God he found in the temple and in the church and in the places of worship was a tame God, a cold God, reduced to simple do's and don'ts, a no God. And Jesus said, this is a false God, an idol, no image. Instead of an idol, you're worshiping an ideology. So Jesus took on the establishment, offered his suggestions, made his critique, and now he's marching into Jerusalem on a donkey to show people his new approach. Or he's going to walk into Jerusalem and confront an establishment that doesn't want his new teaching. As he walked into Jerusalem, the crowds were cheering, and the establishment was losing ground against this Jesus guy and his teachings. And so it went for the one weapon that it had, the one button they could push. They went to tell on Jesus. They went to tell the Romans, said Jesus was a disruptor. He was creating chaos by upending the traditional ways of understanding God and leading people to new ways. Jesus calculated correctly. They knew he wouldn't be able to just ride his donkey through town, corrupting the minds of Jerusalem's sons and daughters, so very much like Socrates had done a few hundred years before in Athens. Jesus was dealing with the big kids at recess, bullying him because he didn't like their regime. He was dealing with the state censoring religion and making God VIP only If you turn on the news and hear about how a certain country got rid of a certain reporter for criticizing the government in 2019, then you can only imagine what Jesus was facing in the year 33 AD. And if I were Jesus, I would have never gone into Jerusalem that day, on Palm Sunday. Jesus was guilty before he arrived. Let me read something from John 11 to you. Many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what Jesus did, believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what he had done. They went to tell him. So the chief priests and the Pharisees called a meeting of the council and said, "What are we going to do with Jesus? This man is performing many signs. And if we let him go on like this," remember, I'm reading from the Bible right now. If we let this guy keep going, he's going to get us all killed. The Romans will come in. They like the order. They like us in charge. It's a little biased, right? So one of them said, this was Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year, said to them, "You know nothing at all." This is what the high priest says. "You don't understand that it's better for you to have one man die for the people than to have the whole nation destroyed." He did not say this on his own, but being the high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus was about to die for the nation, and not for the nation only, but to gather the dispersed children of God. So from that day on, they planned to put him to death. Jesus, therefore, no longer walked openly among the Jews, but went there to a town called Ephraim in the region near the wilderness, and he remained there with the disciples. Now the Passover of the Jews was near. This is where we are in Good Friday. And many went up from the country to Jerusalem before the Passover to purify themselves. They were looking for Jesus and were asking one another as they stood in the temple, "What do you think? There's no way he's showing up today. There's no way he's coming to Jerusalem today. There's no way. Surely he will not come to this festival. Will he?" Now the chief priests and the Pharisees had given order that anyone who knew where Jesus was should let them know so they might arrest him. Jesus knew getting on that donkey, riding into town, and continuing to preach his message would get him nailed to a cross. And that cross became the symbol of Christianity. The weapon, the tool used to put Jesus and his message down, becomes the banner of the new faith. The cross was that guillotine. It was the gun. It was the axe, the punishment, the consequence of challenging the established order. The punishment for swimming in spiritual waters without a tube on. The cross took on a meaning for Jesus. And that's how something takes on meaning. Over the course of Jesus' life, he saw that the one advantage the state religion had on him was power and authority. They had power and authority to keep the search for truth, the search for God, within a certain framework. Jesus did not know growing up he was going to face a cross. Jesus just had learned that in life, there will be hurdles, big and small. And the cross was his biggest hurdle yet. But Jesus faced hurdles as a son, as a sibling, as a Jew, as a peasant, as a carpenter. Because how would a carpenter ever be able to support himself as a self-proclaimed rabbi. He shouldn't be preaching, he should be making cabinets. How could Jesus learn to give a public speech? These were obstacles Jesus would have to cross. He would have to overcome them. And the consequences, his family disowns him. Let's not even talk about crosses and death yet. Before Jesus comes to the cross of Calvary, he gets dishonorably discharged from his family and friends. When Jesus sits with the woman at the well, when Jesus eats food he collected on the Sabbath, when Jesus healed on Holy Day, when Jesus stood up for the adulterous woman, when he sat with the unclean and offered solutions instead of prayers, Jesus was standing up to the way things were and the way things were done. He should have known his place. In the eyes of the people at that time, Jesus was acting way out of line. And Jesus knew it. He knew that ultimately the cross represented everything his people had learned in the past. It was the God they grew up with, the religion they grew up with. The cross was not just the weapon of the state. It had become the weapon of God. If you broke God's laws, if you broke the state's laws, you ended up in jail or dead. Just ask John the Baptist. And yet Jesus rides that donkey into town. The cheers roar, "Hosanna!" which means, God save us. But then again, they don't really know who Jesus is. They don't even know what he's up to. They don't know that this moment is personal for Jesus. They don't know that they're watching history. The very first Holy Week for our faith. And a whole new take on its meaning. So Jesus rides that donkey, preaches, is arrested, beaten, and then sentenced to death on a cross. All along the way, there were so many outs that he never took. And now we can see. Now we can get to the meaning of the cross. It does represent death. It represents a world that is resistant to change. It represents injustice, betrayal, pain, fear, everything that we don't want. It represents the power of the state and its ability to keep order. It represents the past that religion wants us to venerate. Phew. Those leaders must have thought, good thing we got rid of Jesus. But then, the worst thing happened. And one of the priests even warned that this might happen. He said, we can try and put this out, but if this is from God, killing Jesus won't do a thing. In fact, we might be the ones fighting God. Passover ended with a death. All that was left was a story. The story. His story. That you don't have to be a carpenter. That you don't have to believe strict dogmas and doctrines. And you don't have to follow the path everyone wants you to follow. Oh, but what about the rules? Won't you get in trouble? Yeah, you will. There was this guy named Jesus, and he asked the same questions. He did get in trouble. But you know what? It didn't kill him. He's alive. And I could prove it to you. See, when we tell the story of Jesus, when we celebrate the cross through this Holy Week, we are celebrating one man's story to speak his truth and to live his truth in a world that wants him to live by the establishment's truth. Jesus loses that day on the cross, but wins a victory for humankind. Jesus defeats the fear of death, the fear of punishment, in his pursuit of truth. And he realizes that living a fake life is worse than death. That to live someone else's truth actually was death. And that life was standing up to that which threatens to snuff out your flame. Jesus' story inspired the early disciples to do the same thing. They preached what they believed in the midst of persecution, where those first Palm Sundays and Easter holidays were likely celebrated in the same way we're doing today. Quietly, in our homes, we are worshiping God in the midst of trouble. I think Jesus inspired the Protestants a bit too much. We like to protest and fight against everything. Jesus' story teaches us that obstacles, crosses, those things that prevent us from exploring places that might give us truth, meaning, and victory, must be overcome. For the early church, the cross represented overcoming the most difficult challenge we all face: death and our mortality. The cross symbolizes a story. Do you know where inspiration comes from? Stories. And that's what I see when I look up at that cross. It inspires me. The cross tells the story of someone overcoming what was in their way. And in the case of Jesus, it was how Jesus faced death on a cross and overcame it. 3 days later, the disciples were telling his story, that one could overcome the cross. They could even overcome death. And they slapped this label on it. Let's call it the good news. Did you hear about the guy who stood up to the powers that be? Oh, he's probably dead. No. He overcame. 1,987 days later, we are still telling the story. 1,000, I calculated. 1,987 years later, we're still telling the story of how that old rugged cross was Jesus' final hurdle and last sermon to his disciples. That if Christ could overcome his greatest fear, so can my disciples. So can you. Jesus tells his disciples, you're going to have to take up your own cross at some point. You'll have to overcome the past, overcome the present, and all that this life has in store for you. And if you ever begin to waver or doubt, you can just look at the cross. They're everywhere. And know that which looks like the end of your journey is only the beginning. Amen.